He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Hey, folks, welcome to the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. We are joined today by Dr. Thomas Weims. Phil, I did a little research on this guy, and I got to ask you, why do we have him here?
Because he's a really smart guy doing really innovative work is why we have him here. But yeah, really interested to dig into both the research and the subsequent sort of, I guess we would say, putting the research into practice and products or, that are benefiting patients greatly. And so that's why we're here. I first met Dr. Weims and became aware of his work a few years ago at metabolic health meeting. And we'll get into, all of it, but it's all very metabolically based and real interested to have this discussion with him. So before we hop in, Dr. Weims, Thomas, maybe you can give a little bit of your background and talk about how you got interested in kidney disease, which is the field that you specialize in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So hopefully I fit in somehow. Yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara here in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. And my lab has been focusing on kidney disease for 25 years or so, and especially on a genetic form of chronic kidney disease that's called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. That's a pretty common genetic disease that affects about 600,000 people in the US, leads to kidney failure. Eventually patients may need dialysis and kidney transplantation. And our work in my research lab is, kind of course, preclinical. We do mice and rats and test tubes and petri dishes and so on. But in the last few years, we discovered that metabolism is very important in polycystic kidney disease, actually, as it is in all forms of chronic kidney disease, I think. And we found that metabolic interventions, ketogenic metabolic interventions, turn out to be probably more potent in PKD than any of the pharmacological interventions we and others have tried. So that has pivoted our research, initially from looking at trying to find the next new drug target to actually then trying to implement these nutritional therapies. And this has led to the founding of a company out of the university called Santa Barbara Nutrients that makes a medical food called Ketosis-Transforming, and I'm sure we can go into all of this. We also have created a nutritional intervention program for people with polycystic kidney disease. So this has been kind of like a new trajectory. So now we're actually translating findings from the bench, to the bedside, so to speak.
So help me understand, because I'm not medical, what's the root cause of polycystic kidney disease?
Yeah, great question. So it's a genetic disease. A patient would inherit a defective gene from one of their parents, or it can be a brand new mutation. So somebody can be a new mutant. And there are two genes, they're called PKD1 and PKD2. If either of them is mutated, it leads to the same disease. We've spent a lot of time trying to find out what these genes and the gene products, the proteins that they encode actually do. And, many other labs are doing the same thing, and it's still not really clear, I would say. But it is clear that mutations lead to the disease. But what had been the dogma in the field forever, pretty much, was that the progression of polycystic kidney disease is, really driven by the gene mutations, right? So you got the bad gene, you're out of luck. So it's going to progress. And what we found more recently is that that's probably not correct anymore.
I was going to ask, if you're seeing metabolic therapy help, doesn't that kind of contradict the idea that
exactly
it's genetic?
Exactly right. And there's the old medical school wisdom, genes load the gun and diet and lifestyle pull the trigger, which is what we actually think applies to even polycystic kidney disease, right? So somebody inherits a bad gene. That does not necessarily mean they will have rapidly progressing polycystic kidney disease. I would say that is kind of then triggered later on, during the lifetime of the patient by all these many triggers that, we and others have identified. But you're absolutely right. It goes against the dogma, right? So pretty much everybody else in the research field thinks we're crazy, and that couldn't be because nobody had ever thought that way. So everybody is still thinking, it's a genetic disease. Diet and lifestyle makes no difference. Why should we even care? So it's a bit of an uphill battle if you're fighting
Okay,
against
Phil,
dogma.
I
I
understand
think,
why he's here now.
yeah, and I think we're discovering more and more that it's probably good when all the others are calling you crazy. Before maybe we get into why metabolic therapy might help, maybe explain a little bit more about what polycystic, kidney disease, what does it do to the kidney? I guess you could say the structural hallmark, right? Or these multiple cysts, that's what polycystic means, that occur on the kidney. But what does that do to the kidney that causes the trouble?
Yeah, great question. So in patients with PKD, there are thousands of these cysts that form, and they form slowly, during the lifetime of a patient over years and years. And each cyst is derived from a nephron or a segment of a nephron. So they are epithelial cysts. It doesn't really matter what they are structurally, but they keep on growing. They get bigger and bigger, these thousands of cysts, and they start microscopic and they can get as big as, almost like a hand or so. But we have to keep in mind a normal kidney of a human is the size of a fist, right? So we have two of these fist-sized kidneys in our, in our back somewhere. And then in polycystic kidney disease, after years and years of cyst growth, these kidneys can get football size, or much larger even. So they get huge, and then you have two of these huge things in you as a patient, which causes, of course, pain, in the abdomen, just by compression of everything else. And also the kidneys become fibrotic and they essentially eventually stop functioning. So kidney function goes down and down until somebody hits a function where dialysis becomes necessary. So
it's a progressive decline in kidney function besides the direct symptoms that come from this, basically a growing mass within the patient.
Exactly.
And so I guess maybe what got you first thinking that, there may be some impact on this from, metabolic factors? I mean, like you said, if there was this dogma that this is just a genetic thing that you really can't do much about, and that was accepted, what made you first question that and think that maybe there was a metabolic component to this?
Yeah, great question. So it was a bit of an accident in the lab. I had a PhD graduate student in my lab who did an adventurous experiment that wasn't actually really sanctioned by me. And the background was that, we had already years before worked on the mTOR pathway, which I'm sure you've heard about, that has many inputs, from insulin and growth factors, but also from the nutrient status of cells. And we had already shown that this mTOR pathway is a driver of polycystic kidney disease progression. And the student thought, okay, if mTOR is activated by the nutrient status of cells, let me give my mice with polycystic kidney disease, let me give those mice less food to eat. So maybe I can inhibit mTOR in the kidneys that way by just giving them less food. So that's not something I would have thought would work. And luckily he didn't ask me, because I would probably have said, hey, don't waste your time. That's never going to work. So somehow he just did it anyway. And he put his mice on a essentially caloric restriction regimen. So he gave them 23% less food than the control group. And magically, this turned out to be extremely beneficial. So it didn't do anything to these mice. They were happy and healthy, except that their cysts in the kidneys didn't grow anymore and their polycystic kidney disease did not progress. We essentially, we did all the analysis. We did see that mTOR was inhibited, and, we looked at all the parameters at fibrosis, kidney function, and so on, published the paper saying that, hey, caloric restriction works, and we have no idea why it works, really. So we published the paper, and then we spent, a couple more years trying to figure out what's actually going on. And we found that it's actually really the metabolic state of ketosis that is important there. Because if you put mice on a caloric restriction regimen, you actually push them into ketosis, right? And you feed them a pre-weighed amount of food only once a day, and they change their feeding behavior. They eat all the food at once, and then they're fasting for 23 hours in a day. So they get into ketosis for about 12 hours or so, and that turned out to be the key. So if we induce ketosis by like a ketogenic diet, for example, we get an even better result. And we could even mimic the benefits by just supplementing with the ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate. So that was another interesting experiment that, I wouldn't have thought would work. So that's how
Explain that one to me, because you lost me there.
Okay, sure, yes. So the one thing that happens when our body switches into ketosis, so let's say when we're fasting, there's a metabolic shift. We stop burning carbohydrates, not completely, obviously.
Right.
And then we increase, the burning of fat, and some of the fats get turned into ketones. That's,
Right.
where the name ketosis comes from.
Right.
It happens in the liver. The liver turns the fat into ketones, puts it back into circulation. And the main ketone is called beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. That's kind of the main circulating ketone.
Oh, that's one of the components of the ketones. Okay. All right.
So there are essentially, you can say, two ketones that do anything, and the main one is really beta-hydroxybutyrate. So someone in the lab thought, oh, what if it is just the beta-hydroxybutyrate that somehow inhibits progression of PKD? So we put beta-hydroxybutyrate into the drinking water for these mice and found that it replicates the beneficial effects of nutritional ketosis. So we keep the mice on their normal food, normal amounts of food, same type of food. We just add beta-hydroxybutyrate and get the same effect. So that's something I didn't personally expect. I didn't think that would work, but it did.
Just to clarify, so the last experiment you described, you put the mice back on the regular diet. They weren't doing the 1 hour a day thing.
Exactly.
But supplementing with the BHB got the same results that you got with the mice that were just allowed to eat for 1 hour.
Exactly, yeah. That was, of course, exciting because it told us that this BHB seems to be the active ingredient, if you will, of nutritional ketosis, which is nice potentially for clinical translation, and because you could just do that to patients, right? So you just give them beta-hydroxybutyrate instead of having them, go through a very strict ketogenic diet for the rest of their life.
And also that sort of tells you, because, some people would look at that and say, okay, maybe there's just something about eating less calories, or, given the the dogma that we now know not to be true in kidney disease, that protein is damaging to the kidneys. And some may look at your original experiment and say, just getting rid of the protein is what benefited the kidneys. But that kind of final, experiment that you described, where you're supplementing BHB on top of a normal diet, kind of disproves both of those things.
Exactly, yeah. And it kind of fits with many other things that are maybe also a little bit against dogma. There are some drugs like the SGLT2 inhibitors, the aficionados will have heard about them. They're extremely popular drugs used for chronic kidney disease. What they do is, they make the patient pee out the blood sugar, essentially, right? So you lower your blood sugar, and they also induce ketosis. So a patient on SGLT2 inhibitors will have an increase in the BHB, and that is usually not acknowledged by practitioners. But I think that is actually the renoprotective effect. That's what protects the kidneys, is actually the BHB that the patients produce themselves. And in fact, this has already been proven by a Japanese group a couple of years ago in a really nicely done mechanistic study. They have shown that, the BHB production after, they give mice the SGLT2 inhibitor drugs, that's key to the kidney protection. So I think this fits very well with what we are finding. Yeah.
And so that kind of leads to the question of, great that you demonstrated this for, polycystic kidney disease. That's a very particular kidney disease, but, how much does it extend and overlap to kidney disease in general? Obviously, PKD isn't the most common cause of kidney disease by any means. And, the more common kidney disease that we see that leads to, high incidence of dialysis and all of that, how applicable do you think these findings are to that?
Great question. I actually think it is 100% applicable to all of pretty much any form of chronic kidney disease. And of course, the big one is, the diabetes-induced chronic kidney disease, that's over half. If you add to that everything that has to do with hypertension, which to me is kind of diabetes and hypertension go hand in hand anyway, it's pretty much, the vast majority of cases of chronic kidney disease are caused by that. So there are plenty of preclinical studies already where people have looked at different rodent models of different forms of chronic kidney disease, and you can essentially treat them with any form of ketogenic metabolic therapy, including supplementing them with beta-hydroxybutyrate, and it improves the kidney disease. So in animals, I think that's beyond a doubt that it really works very well. There are clinical studies already, ketogenic metabolic therapy in diabetic kidney disease, essentially. And some of these studies are even long-term. They're not really controlled in a way, that it would pass an FDA type of approval for a drug, right? Because how do you ever do a randomization and a blinded placebo or anything like that? Right? There's no placebo for food. So these studies are oftentimes kind of disregarded, and they never make it into meta-analyses, for example, because they only consider, FDA type of standard studies. But the studies are out there, and we've actually published a couple of review articles, putting it all together, making the case that ketogenic metabolic therapy would be effective in any form of chronic kidney disease and, should be the first line therapy. I think between now and then, when that actually happens, there's going to be many years of convincing to do. But I think we'll get there eventually.
What's the old story behind that? Let me back up one step. 10, 12 years ago, I had a friend who had severe type 2 diabetes. Long story short, he ended up on a ketogenic diet, but there was this massive fear about, oh my God, all that protein, you're going to damage your kidneys. Now, we know that's basically just bogus. My question is, why was that ever even considered a problem, that being in a state of ketosis would damage your kidneys?
That's a really interesting story. It's almost lost in history because it's almost, you learn it in medical school and
Right.
in nephrology fellowship and so on. And it's based, if you go back in time, where does it actually come from? I would say it is largely based on one very influential paper in the, I think, early 80s or so, 1980s, by a very influential nephrologist by the name of Barry Brenner, who also happened to run the standard nephrology textbook that is used to this day by everybody. And that paper is very interesting because it's a purely hypothetical paper, right? There's no data in there. And he makes the argument that it's actually really interesting. So I actually went back and read this whole paper and discovered that there's a really interesting premise in that paper, which makes a lot of sense because he argued that prehistoric humans, during our human evolution, would have eaten a lot of protein, but they would have eaten it only once every 2 days on average, right? Because, hunter-gatherers,
Right.
you're out of luck, for most of the time, but then you
Gorge
catch.
and fast rather than.
Exactly, right. So he was saying, okay, every 2 days, our ancestors ate a bunch of meat, and it would have pushed up what's called the glomerular filtration rate. So the way the kidneys function, the protein that you ingest kind of increases the kidney function, and then once they're done eating for a while, it goes back down to lower levels. And he was saying that was beneficial. It goes up and down every 2 days. That's the perfect thing for our kidneys. But that in today's times, we're eating all the time, right? So we're eating like whatever, 6 meals a day. So it always stays high, right? So the kidneys have to crank out the filtration activity all day long. And he hypothesized that this is what damages kidneys. And so all this sounds completely logical and makes a lot of sense. But then the not so logical conclusion was then to put all patients on a low protein diet and let them keep eating 6 meals a day, but just make it a low protein meal. To you and me and anyone logically thinking that is not the conclusion. It's a
That
real
sounds like literally the
I know.
polar opposite conclusion you should come to, but
Right. Yes. So the logical conclusion would be to say, hey, let's take this patient with kidney disease and put him on a prehistoric diet, only make him eat twice a day the meat, and they should go back, to have a better kidney function. And that doesn't happen. If you suggest this today to any nephrologist, they would scream and their hair would be on fire and they would, show you out of the room or something.
Along those lines, and given the sort of current environment and thinking around kidney disease still, which unfortunately, as we know in the mainstream, it hasn't really changed, right? It's still those thoughts. Are you finding, I guess, more acceptance of the concept of supplement with beta-hydroxybutyrate, give the ketone bodies, and perhaps not change the diet per se, or stick to your low protein diet, your low fat diet, all that bad advice, but at least give some beta-hydroxybutyrate, as opposed to trying to convince people that a ketogenic diet is really the best approach to kidney disease?
Yeah, so that also turned out to be really difficult. And I think it has to do with nephrologists, the kidney doctors being rightfully conservative and a little bit anti-supplements. And that makes sense because a lot of the supplement industry is notorious for selling a lot of crap to people and manufacturing standards and this and that and all kinds of fillers. And, if you're talking about like herbal extracts, plant extracts with like thousands of substances in there that nobody even knows what they are. Many of them might actually cause chronic kidney disease or acute kidney injury. I can totally understand that a nephrologist typically says no supplements, right, to their patients. And so beta-hydroxybutyrate is not a drug, right? You can just buy it on Amazon. It's essentially an approved food ingredient. You buy it as a supplement. And so if it were a drug, I think it would be very easily accepted by doctors because they love FDA approval and they say, hey, it's already approved, go ahead. If something goes wrong, don't blame me. What the FDA told me to prescribe it to you. But since there's no approval process, for supplements or medical foods, and in our case, we actually made it a medical food, they're not on board easily. So we've seen this over and over again that patients can find out about our research and our, the company and the product that we're making. But as soon as they bring the information to their kidney doctors, they get a hard no from them oftentimes. So that's also why we're doing clinical trials right now to look at long-term outcomes, in a controlled way to, convince the establishment.
I was looking at your website, and you used a phrase on your website, and you've used it several times. Medical food?
Yeah, good question.
What makes a food a medical food?
Yes. Yeah, so most people, including me, before we started all this, have never heard of medical foods. So the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration regulates drugs, of course, and regular foods and supplements and devices. And there's one more category that's called medical foods. That's also regulated by the FDA. And, there are certain definitions. What is a medical food? Basically, the ingredients in medical foods have to be approved or, safe food ingredients. This is the whole concept of GRAS, generally recognized as safe, GRAS. So if something is GRAS, it can be in a medical food. Interestingly, supplements don't have to be GRAS. Supplements don't have to be safe. So you can throw anything into a supplement you want and you sell it as a supplement. But medical foods have to be GRAS, the ingredients have to be GRAS. And it turns out that beta-hydroxybutyrate is considered GRAS, and the other main component in our product is citric acid, which obviously is GRAS. People use it for cooking and baking and so on. So we were able to put this together in a way that it would qualify as a medical food, which has some advantages because then you can actually put on the label what disease it's meant for, that it's, for chronic kidney disease, for example, and for polycystic kidney disease, which is not something you can put on a supplement label, right? You would break the rules. If you say, here's a supplement for chronic kidney disease, that's actually against the rules. So anyway, yeah, so that's what it is, a medical food.
The interesting kind of, I guess concept, right? Because many of us would argue that all food is medicine or should be medicine, right? Or maybe a lot of what's called food is poison, but true food is medicine. And, that you need this sort of concept of a medical food is interesting. Maybe talk a little bit about what the status in humans is. You talked about kind of the research in mice and such, which is always interesting, but does it translate to humans? So what kind of experience do you have so far? And maybe talk about what some of the ongoing trials are.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few trials already published that we were involved in. Maybe the biggest one, most important one, was published about a year and a little bit ago. And there was a randomized controlled trial, so kind of like the top level of medical trial evidence. That was done at the University of Cologne in Germany by our long-term collaborators there, led by Dr. Roman Müller. And I was comparing a ketogenic diet, versus no change in diet in people with polycystic kidney disease. And it was only meant as a 3-month pilot trial, right? So to look at feasibility, safety primarily. And what we found is, yes, it is feasible, yes, it is safe, but it also gave us an efficacy signal after only 3 months. So after 3 months on a ketogenic diet, the patients had a statistically significant increase in kidney function, which is unheard of. So in polycystic kidney disease, kidney function only goes down over time, but it's progressive. There's no single clinical trial where it has ever been found to go up. We found it go up. So after 3 months, and this was, we scrutinized it with different markers of kidney function, same result for any marker. We also saw that total kidney volume, right? So if you measure the kidneys by MRI scanning, you can get a sense for the progression by just measuring how big the kidneys are. And same thing, normally kidneys only get bigger over time. In this case, we found them to get smaller after only 3 months on the ketogenic diets, which is again a readout of progression of the disease. So extremely surprising to be so effective after a short time. But the data is the data, but we published it. And I would say most of the colleagues in the field don't want to hear about it because they say, whoa, this has never been seen before. And, that is against dogma that things can ever get better in polycystic kidney disease. There must be something wrong. And actually, interestingly, once a paper came out, I sent it to some of the colleagues and I got one of them replied and said, oh, of course, kidney function goes up because you give them more protein. And the other one said independently, oh, of course, protein function goes up because you give them less protein. And so it just made no sense. And there was actually no change in protein in the whole study.
Yeah. I just want to clarify. So that was just diet, right? That wasn't,
Right.
or were you supplementing
Yes.
with beta-hydroxybutyrate?
No, good point. This was only diet, so only ketogenic diet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Since then, and the reason is, but this was started a while ago, before we even had the product on the market. Now we have a study in full swing in Tokyo at Nintendo University. That's a study that actually looks at this medical food, Ketositra. And it is Ketositra in conjunction with dietary changes. So we kind of throw the whole package at it. And this study, it's a 1-year follow-up with a control group, and the first patients are already at the 1 year mark, but the enrollment is for 200 patients altogether, so it's going to take a while to get 200 patients through the whole study. But we're hoping to have some interim data to look at in a little bit, after the first 10 or so patients are through it with 1 year. So that will be interesting to see how it looks like after a year for 10 people. So far, from all I can see is, it's going really well. The patients are happy. Nobody has had any problems in the study.
We had Dr. Chris Palmer on, a year and a half ago, psychiatrist, and he accidentally stumbled into the surprising reality that mental health patients who converted to a state of therapeutic ketosis began to see their mental health problems fixed. And that led to his research about therapeutic ketosis and mental health. My question is, what happened with you when this grad student went off and do something that you wouldn't have authorized? Did it completely change the direction, the trajectory of your work?
Actually, it did. Yes, we started to really look into it. And I should say, when this first came up, nobody knew much about what ketosis even is. If you look at medical textbooks, for example, you'll not find much in there, and you find lots of wrong information, for example. So I had to educate myself. And where do you go? The literature was pretty useless already, and I actually found almost like influencers, like you guys, for example, to be a better source of information. So you go to YouTube, you listen to podcasts, where you go to things like the Metabolic Health Summit, which is kind of where all the pioneering work is being discussed. So that's definitely not in any textbook, you could, just look it up or anything like that. So yeah, so after some time convincing ourselves that there could be something to it, and doing more and more experiments, and pretty much everything working right away, which is unusual. Usually there's lots of hiccups, but this was an amazing project. We just say, okay, let's try a ketogenic diet, and we get the result, massive effect.
Wow.
Thing, yeah.
Do folks who have PKD, are they typically obese, or does it affect the body that way? The reason I'm asking is I'm just wondering if the BHB
Right.
also leads to the kind of pretty significant fat loss that a lot of folks experience. In fact,
Right.
that's the goal of their goal, getting on a keto diet.
Right. Yeah, great question. People with PKD are, similarly obese, let's say in America, like most Americans are. However, another group has already found that there's an association between the degree of overweight and obesity and the progression of polycystic kidney disease. So people that are more obese tend to have faster progression of PKD. So there's a good association there. Interestingly, there was a study presented at the last kidney conference. I don't think it has been published yet. It was just an abstract from a Japanese group. So they have looked at people with PKD in Japan versus people with PKD in the US. And, they've compared the BMI between those two populations. Of course, people in Japan are skinnier, right? So their BMI is on average lower. And they found, I believe it was about 5 years longer kidney life in Japan, right? So people have 5 years more getting out of their kidneys before they end up on dialysis, just simply because they are a little bit skinnier on average. So that I found that very interesting. We have done an interesting retrospective analysis. So after we published our study, the initial mouse and rat study, a lot of people with PKD were starting on their own on ketogenic diets. And that's kind of when COVID hit and the whole lab got, shut down. We couldn't really do our work. And I happened to have a nephrology fellow in my lab at the time. So I said, hey, let's do a clinical study, while we're, doing nothing else. And let's try to see if we can identify people with polycystic kidney disease that have already experimented with ketogenic diets on their own. We found actually about 130 patients that raised their hand and said, yep, I've done it. We got all the medical data, we got, questionnaires, and they reported benefits, including increase in kidney function, decrease, of course, in BMI, decrease in pain levels, and so on. Everything was pointing in the right direction, which gave us more confidence then to also do the randomized control trial.
It makes
And
sense.
yeah, and along the same lines, have you or any other groups that you know of looked at progression of polycystic kidney disease, PKD, in people who are, metabolically healthy versus not, or, along that stratum, as opposed to obesity, which isn't, it correlates, but it's not the same thing as metabolic health.
Right. I would say that has not been done yet. It would actually be not too difficult to try to figure that out from potentially existing cohorts of patients out there. Maybe not a bad idea to look at some metabolic markers and see what the association is. One can kind of tease apart there.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see.
Right.
So thinking about, going back to that sort of discussion on, ketogenic diets versus supplementing ketones, I know you're not giving patients advice by any means, but how do you think about that difference? If someone is trying to improve their kidney function, do you think one is better than the other, or maybe the combination of the two? How do you think this kind of plays out clinically for people?
Great question. Yeah. And yes, absolutely. I'm not giving any medical advice to anyone. And of course, every patient is different. People have comorbidities and this and that. But in general, what I always recommend is, start with Ketosis, the exogenous ketone, as the easiest thing you can possibly do, right? Because all you have to do is, it comes in a can, it's a powder, you dissolve it in water, it turns into a lemonade drink, you drink it. Anyone can do that. And it doesn't require any lifestyle change or anything like that. You don't have to cook different. I would say that's step number one. But I hate the idea of then people thinking, oh, they have a free pass now to eat whatever junk they can, which I think then that backfires, right? So I always say, okay, this is only step one, take the product and then start to work on your cleaning up your diet and lifestyle, after that. And, pick one thing at a time, maybe decrease your soda intake, decrease your sugar intake, and then work on the next thing, think about starch. Work on the next thing. Think about renal stressors such as oxalate, for example, or inorganic phosphate, food additives. Change your diet, away from ultra-processed foods and, focus on whole foods, that kind of thing. So yeah. I mean, I don't think of this product as a magic pill to just tell people that's it, now enjoy your life. I mean, of course, people should enjoy their life, but not by damaging themselves. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess maybe shifting a little bit and talking about sort of the research environment, I'd be curious to hear who supports your research, because, we certainly hear that the majority of research, funded by pharmaceutical companies looking to develop drugs. Now, you've been able to kind of turn your research into a product, but I'm curious about how the research got funded in the first place, who was supporting this, since it was sort of counter narrative, counterintuitive.
Great question. Yes. So I'm very lucky. We have some philanthropic supporters, of the research lab in the university. So there's a really terrific family out of New York, for example. They're affected by polycystic kidney disease. They have been very generous in supporting the research, which is a lifesaver, because then we have funds to just go wherever the science leads, as opposed to writing up a proposal saying this is exactly what we want to do in the next 5 years, and then you can't really deviate too much from it. So that I'm really grateful we have that kind of support. But we also had NIH funding, which turned out to be also really important. So I have a grant on this whole keto story, and we had a grant that I have to get renewed on a different story, which is also has to do with nutritional changes, and it has to do with microcrystals that can form kidney stones and so on. NIH, I think is really important. However, I should say there is I would say there has always been a bias against anything that has to do with nutritional interventions, right? So when I wrote up these NIH grants, I made them sound very mechanistic, and you don't put the word diet and lifestyle in there too much. Otherwise, I think, the review panels are not very interested in it. That might change. Now the whole NIH is a different beast and nobody knows yet what's going to happen there. But interestingly, just before this change in administration, we had proposed a big NIH study through an academic investigator to do a clinical trial on a ketogenic, or actually on this medical food in polycystic kidney disease. So we asked for $4 million, and the peer review panel, which is an independent peer review panel of the NIH, was actually very positive. So they recommended it for funding and gave it a great percentile. And then it hit the top level brass at the Kidney Institute at the NIH, and they essentially said no, which is extremely unusual to overrule a peer review panel. So the person there in charge said, we don't want a nutritional study. And they're essentially said the main reason why they didn't like the study was that our effect size is too good. So the effect sizes we had seen in rats and mice and, in the randomized controlled study in humans is too good. That can't be, but nobody's ever seen anything like this. This shouldn't be studied.
Let's not study it. It works too well.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
amazing.
So
Bloody
that was
brilliant.
the argument. But that was before the administration changes. Who knows? Everybody is probably these days getting fired over there anyway, and who knows who we're dealing with, going forward. I have no idea.
Yeah. And then have you run into roadblocks on the publication side of things when you're trying to, get these studies published?
Right. That is always a bit of a battle because the typical reviewers, don't know much about ketosis, and almost everybody gets ketosis and ketoacidosis confused, strangely enough. I actually found recently, I got a 30 or 40-year-old medical dictionary on a garage sale for $1 from the American Medical Association. I looked up the definition of ketosis, and wouldn't you know it, it was completely wrong. It's kind of a mishmash of ketosis and ketoacidosis. So maybe we can't blame the doctors because they kind of learned it wrong back then. And that's pretty much inevitable. Reviews always come back saying, oh, but isn't there a danger of ketoacidosis? What do you do about it? And this kind of thing. Then you have to start explaining it. It shouldn't happen because people should really know better by now, but that's still what it is.
Good grief. Because I don't have kidney disease, but I think this is fascinating, my brain automatically goes to, oh, say BHB is the ketone that really seems to help. So what if we start supplementing with BHB, even if we don't have kidney disease? And it reminded me of a guest we had on a while back, Phil. I don't remember who it was, but they had asked, they were a researcher, and they'd asked the question about what is what's the difference in results between using exogenous ketones and endogenous ketones? And as best as I've been able to tell from the little bit that I've studied, and again, I'm not medical, I'm just a dude, there's no consensus. Do you have any opinion on this subject?
Yes. So I think, of course, nutritional ketosis, does probably more than just supplementing with a ketone, right? Because you also, you stabilize your, blood glucose levels and your insulin levels, right? And, so it's a much larger change. So I think for some conditions, some diseases that might be needed. So not only the bump up in the blood level of ketones, but, all the other things as well. For other conditions that may be less critical, where it's maybe mostly the beta-hydroxybutyrate that does the heavy lifting, I might say that maybe kidney disease is one of those, where a lot of the heavy lifting might be done by the beta-hydroxybutyrate. So in that case, just supplementing it is probably a good idea. Again, without giving people a free pass, to then now go
Sure.
overboard. But, one thing I think where exogenous ketones also really help with is to smoothen things out, right? Because it's almost impossible for most people to just stick with a very strict ketogenic diet forever and ever, right? So they slip up, they have all kinds of other problems in their real lives that makes them, not be in ketosis anymore. But if they can continue taking the exogenous ketones during those times, that might carry them through and, maybe makes them come back onto the wagon easier afterwards. I think it's a good way of doing it.
So, Phil, this is a question for both of you. As I understand it, the ketones are the byproduct of the fat being burned, being used as a fuel in our bloodstream. The fats, whatever it is, released into our blood, and that is used as the fuel. And the presence of ketones in the urine, I guess, is the evidence that you are in therapeutic ketosis. So my question is, if you're taking an exogenous ketone supplement, isn't it going to end up in your it's going to end up in your urine anyway, whether it actually came from your fat or not? Are you getting the benefit of those ketones being used as fuel? Are they getting into your blood so that they can be used by your cells? I think that's the question I'm asking. And that question may actually reveal the depth of my ignorance. But
Yeah, it's a good question. I can quickly answer it. So when you take exogenous ketones, it doesn't really get peed out that much, right? Even if you're in nutritional ketosis, your liver makes a lot of ketones. A little bit gets peed out, and that's why you can detect it with a dipstick. But your body doesn't want to lose that on purpose, right? So most of it just gets consumed, right? So it's in circulation, it's in your blood, all the cells in the body, including like the brain, for example, where they soak it up. They burn it for energy. So you don't really lose that much in the urine. And it doesn't matter if it comes from the liver or whether you're drinking it, it's the same thing. It just goes into circulation and you have the same effect throughout the body.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the more maybe in-depth question to ask about that is, if you are in nutritional ketosis and therefore kind of lower levels of glucose at least, versus, if you're eating a regular diet and you might have higher levels of glucose and you're taking the supplement, the sort of competition there for the fuel utilization, I think maybe might, in my mind, can be one of the factors that might limit the effectiveness of just taking the supplement. Right. Not that it's not going to be effective, just that it may not be as effective as if you're in this truly ketogenic state where, ketones are now the primary fuel source available to the cells.
Yeah, I agree. There are some functions of beta-hydroxybutyrate, interestingly, that are completely independent of its metabolism, right? So most people think of it as a molecule that just gets burned by cells for energy. However, it is also, I would consider it a hormone. It has its own receptor on cells, so cells can sense BHB. That receptor is a G protein coupled receptor, for example. It has like its own signaling pathways and so on. BHB can also be highly anti-inflammatory, and that goes through another pathway called the NLRP3 inflammasome, for example. So it has some benefits on its own that are probably have nothing to do with blood glucose control or anything like that, right? So if you have ketones floating around your blood, you will have these benefits that are just the hormone function of BHB.
Yeah, and BHP has also been shown to suppress appetite as well. Again, lots of, it's always interesting with these things, right? We measure the BHP and we think that's what's, that has the effects, and it certainly does. But, as you said earlier, nutritional ketosis is more than just BHP. And, we're learning every day, right? The power of this. What struck me earlier when you were saying about the results of your study, with kidney function actually improving, that was never really thought to be feasible. And, we look at all these other areas that we're seeing similar things being demonstrated, diabetes, which is
Right.
always thought to be a progressive disease that can never improve and reverse. And yet we're seeing it improve and reverse routinely now. And even, my area of focus, heart disease, that we're seeing improvements in it that just weren't thought to be possible before.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's amazing. I thank you for this innovative and groundbreaking research that you're doing. If people want to learn more and kind of follow along, because as you said, this is active, right? You have active trials going on and you're learning more every day. Where's the best place for them to follow you and learn more about it?
The best place is probably our Facebook group from my research lab. If somebody's on Facebook, just type in Weims lab and anyone can join it. That group has about like 4,000 people with polycystic kidney disease in it. There's lots and lots of discussions back and forth going on. People are reporting on their progress and so on, have questions. So it's a public group. Anyone can join it anytime. That's probably the number one point.
And we'll
And you
have
got
that.
I noticed the website, SantaBarbaraNutrients.com. There's some, I wandered around in there for a while and there's some really good information. Although to be frank, I had no idea I was going to be as interested as it turns out here. I just want to highlight, underline, call attention to again, what you said at the very beginning, that the idea that therapeutic ketosis damages the kidneys came from the standard textbook, which has no clinical experiential backing. It was just a guy's theory, but
The protein part of that,
but
yes.
not really subjected to any kind of test.
Unfortunately.
I'll be frank, as a non-medical person, I'm getting really tired of this. So thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for following the science where the science leads instead of not thinking. All right.
Well, thank you
I'll
both
stop.
too.
I'll stop my brief rant.
Yes, yeah. No, but I should also return the compliment because what you guys are doing and others like you, I think is really invaluable. Without that, I wouldn't have learned things about ketogenic therapy that I know now. So currently that's the only source of reliable information I would say out there, even for doctors, where else are going to get the information?
Wow.
Thank you guys for doing that.
Wow. Good job, Phil.
Thank you. Yeah, knew this would be a good one.
All right. Our guest has been Dr. Thomas Weims. As he said, you can follow his work on Facebook at Weims Lab, Weims Lab. That contact information will be in the show notes. And the website is santabarbaranutrients.com. Thanks for joining us. For Dr. Phil Ovedi, I'm Jack Heald. We'll talk to you next time.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovedi's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.